What is going on, fellow logistics and transportation people of YouTube? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be breaking down the new hours of service rules and regulations that have been put forth by the FMCSA. Talk about what they mean for shippers, talk about what they mean for carriers, talk about what they mean for drivers, and most importantly, talk about why you need to know them. So without further ado, let's jump into it. All right, so here we go. So like I said in the intro, we're going to be breaking down the new hours of service rules today, talking about what they mean and why you need to know about them. So first, let's take a step back. If you're new to logistics, if you're new to transportation, you're doing some YouTube and you're wondering what the hell is an hours of service? What is the FMCSA? Let's break those two things down for you really quickly. So the FMCSA is the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. So that is a function that operates within the Department of Transportation. It was organized and founded in January of the year 2000. And effectively what they do is just create policies, regulations, and then enforce those policies and regulations specific to commercial driver safety. So that includes things like the hours of service or the HOS rules that we're going to break down today. It includes things like commercial vehicle safety and regulations, policies of that sort of thing. The hours of service rules, or the HOS rules as you'll hear them called, are specifically a segment of regulations that apply to commercial drivers. So these could be commercial motor coach drivers, private motor coach drivers, school bus drivers, but most notably, and within the context of how we're going to define it today, it's commercial truck drivers. And what the HOS rules really state is they provide a framework for how many hours a driver can work, how many hours a driver can drive, and how much rest that they have to take in combination with those things, specifically as it pertains to traditionally 24-hour windows and 7-week windows. So really what the HOS rules were designed and created and implemented to do is cut down on the likelihood or the amount of accidents that a driver may be responsible for due to things like fatigue, not taking enough rest, not getting enough sleep, or that sort of thing. So you can imagine the amount of pressure and stress that gets placed on a driver. That might be pressure from the shipper, that might be pressure from dispatch, that might just be pressure to get things done and pressure they're placing on themselves. But either way, you can imagine that a driver might be tempted to go, push themselves beyond the limits of what they're actually capable of, get really tired, and then unfortunately cause an accident, which could be fatal or not. Either way, the HOS rules were put into place to deter that, to say, hey, look, Mr. Driver, we've put a cap on the amount of hours that you can drive. We've put a floor on the amount of rest that you have to take. And hopefully that deters driver fatigue and ultimately makes U.S. infrastructure and highways more safe for both consumers and for commercial drivers. So again, the main elements of the HOS rules are the amount of drive time, the amount of duty time, which is basically the amount of time you're working, your off-duty time, your rest time, the time you spend in a sleeper berth, and that sort of thing. And we'll really break those terms down and what they mean and how they apply a little bit later in the video. So HOS rules are something that have come under increased scrutiny in recent years, going back to 2003, and then as recent as 2017 relative to electronic logging mandates and that sort of thing. And we'll dig into that a little bit as well. What I want to do first is really quickly go through how the HOS rules are enforced, and then what is the punishment for a driver who's found to be potentially in violation or going over the amount of allotted hours that they have. So first, let's talk about how they're enforced. So traditionally, HOS rules are enforced by the state level DOT officer. So most likely this is going to be a state trooper or some sort of state level law enforcement. You'll also see drivers potentially having to show their hours at weigh stations and check stations and that sort of thing. If a driver is found to be in violation of their HOS or over the amount of allotted hours that they have, then their carrier or themselves can get a downgrade relative to their safety rating. They can also certainly be hit with fines. That driver might potentially be at risk of being terminated or losing their commercial license status or something along those lines. So it's certainly something that you don't want to be found in violation of for your own good. So obviously, if a driver can be found in violation of this, then there must be a way for them to track it. So how does a driver log or track their hours in 2020? Well, up until a few years ago, most drivers were using good old-fashioned pen and paper and tracking this with paper logs, right? So making note of when they started driving, where they were, when they stopped driving, when they took their breaks, how long their breaks were, and that sort of thing. The challenge with this from a regulatory standpoint, from a compliance standpoint, is that it was really easy to lie and kind of fudge things a little bit naturally. And because of the pressures that drivers are under, they were a little bit naturally incentivized to do that. And that created a lot of problems, and it certainly created a lot of challenge actually enforcing the HOS rules themselves. So in 2017, the FMCSA came out with this ELD mandate, which if you've been in the industry for a few years is probably something you've heard. It was effectively a 2-year phased-in window that gave drivers and carriers enough time to get into compliance with the new ELD mandates. But long story short, really what it was meant to do was replace traditional paper logs with electronic logging devices, a little bit more of a modern technology instead. And what the ELD did is kind of two things. One, it actually went ahead and took a lot of the thought process out of actually logging your hours and your breaks and that sort of thing. Most ELDs will actually plug right into your engine data so they know if the truck is moving, how fast it's gone, how long it's been operating, how many miles it's driven, when a break is being taken, and that sort of thing, which makes, again, the enforcement and actually staying in compliance a little bit easier. And then secondary to that is really just piggybacking off that compliance thing. There's a lot of rules and a lot of pages to this litigation and a lot of nuances and that sort of thing. So it can be really, really difficult for a driver to actually know if they're in compliance or not. The actual ELD device kind of made that a little bit more easier by having logic and knowledge built into it to tell you, hey, you're going to have to take a break in this much time, 1 hour till you need to pull over, whatever it might be. So it really kind of took a lot of the confusion for the drivers out of the picture a little bit. Now that was also met with a lot of scrutiny because the infrastructure needed to make a truck ELD compliant was not cheap. Most carriers out there are really just small shops with a few trucks. There's obviously tons of independent owner operators out there. They're not all these large conglomerate trucking companies. And so that really pulled a lot of capacity off the road because a lot of trucks just didn't come into compliance, went out of service, potentially shifted what they were doing to some other mode of transportation, maybe going and working in the oil fields and that sort of thing. So there was a lot of scrutiny to that regulation that came out as part of that. So that brings us back to the HOS rules specifically. So what I want to do really quickly before we get into the rule change that the FMCSA put forth recently is just highlight some of the more important terminology within the hours of service rules and then talk about some of the more capstone events that have happened in the last few years just to bring you up to speed on how we got to where we are here in May of 2020. So let's break down some of the terms. So I've got them written down here. So the first one I think that's important is the on-duty terminology. So really, on-duty, if we're going to go by the proper definition, is defined as the time from when a driver begins to work or is required to be in readiness to work until the driver is relieved from work and all responsibility for performing work. So really what this means in layman's terms is this is the amount of time from when you check into the job to when you check out of the job. This includes being at a plant, this includes being at the terminal, this includes being in detention, this includes crossing a border, really all of those things. And it also obviously includes driving time. So then with that, the second terminology is the driving time. That's pretty straightforward. This is the amount of time that you spend behind the wheel and at the controls of the commercial motor vehicle. So then you've got sleeper berth time. Naturally, a sleeper berth are the commercial vehicles with a sleeper component to them that you see on the road. The sleeper berth time is any amount of time spent inside the sleeper berth. And it's important that they note here that the simple definition is an area separate from the driving controls that includes a bed, and the rules do not explicitly require that a driver must sleep, only that a driver take a period of rest. So in other words, what the FMCSA was saying here is that, look, we don't really have any control over what a driver does during their off-duty time. We just strongly encourage that they do sleep during their periods of rest, and we hope that's what they do, but there's no actual definition or difference between rest time and sleep time. And then lastly, you've got off-duty time. This is just time that is not spent on duty, not driving, or not in the sleeper berth. So now real quickly, let's just hit some of the major events that have happened starting in 2003 with the introduction of the 34-hour restart period. So really what this meant was that up until this point, drivers could only gain more driving time basically with the passing of each day. So you had your 70 hours of total driving time that you had in a week. You had to wait till the start of the next day to gain your additional driving time. With the 34-hour restart, what that really meant is that a driver could effectively reset that 70-hour clock at any point after 34 hours of consecutive off-duty time. So then in 2005, this is when the FMCSA came out with the 8 hours of consecutive rest period, thus kind of creating the modern 8-2 split that you've probably heard of, which effectively states that within your 10 hours of rest or off-duty time that you have to get in a given day, 8 hours of those must be taken consecutively with a separate 2 hours of off-duty at some other point within that 24-hour period. So that is the 8-2 split that you'll hear commonly referred to these days, which is that 8-hour rest period followed by that 2-hour off-duty time. Previously, drivers were given a little bit more flexibility in how they break that up, and some drivers might take, 2 4-hour naps, so to speak, or something along those lines. This put a little bit tighter regulation and tighter focus on that 8 consecutive hours, and again, thus the creation of the 8-2 split. So then in 2011, the FMCSA came out with the HOS final rule. Now, this was met with a little bit of controversy and pushback, naturally, from all sides of the equation, but there were some really important highlights in this that I just want to call out. So first was the creation of this 30-minute break provision. And really what that said was that a driver would have to take a 30-minute break within the first 8 hours of their on-duty time. Now, again, that's not within the first 8 hours of their driving time. That's within the first 8 hours of their on-duty time. So a driver who maybe punches in has 3 to 4 hours of on-duty time before they actually start operating and driving the commercial vehicle, technically is eating into that 8-hour window before they've ever started driving. So for example, a driver starts his day at a ship or dock. He's tied up in loading or something else at that dock for 4 hours. He then starts operating his vehicle. 4 hours into that drive time, he's now hit his 8 hours of on-duty time and technically has to take a 30-minute break. Second thing that was important in that regulation is that the 34-hour restart rule was still kept in place. However, the FMCSA came forth to put in new regulation that said a driver could only utilize the 34-hour restart once within a 168-hour or a 7-day period. So really what this was meant to do was to encourage drivers to take, multiple days off or a 2-day off period a la the weekend to really allow them to get back to those major rest periods. And again, just be additional deterrents towards fatigue and tiredness that might lend themselves to commercial accidents on the freeways. And then lastly, and probably most notably, was the reduction in the total amount of driving hours that an operator would be allotted in a 7-day period from 82 to 70. So a big reduction in the total amount of hours that they could drive within a 7-day period. So the 2011 rule change was met with quite a bit of critique from trucking industry advocates, basically stating that this was an overstep of the FMCSA say that they were putting more regulations and tighter policies in place, despite the fact that in their eyes, truck accidents were on a downward curvature, and that really all this was going to do was put additional constraints, remove capacity from the market, and ultimately result in higher costs for consumers. So now, with all of that, we can get to the HOS rules that the FMCSA put forth just recently, and talk about some of the major elements of that are going to change moving forward. Now, it's important to note that these rules have not gone into effect yet. So they technically go into effect 120 days after submission. So I'm recording this in mid-May of 2020, which means that these should go into effect probably sometime in September of 2020, assuming that there's no additional litigation or dispute on this sort of thing. So if you're watching this sometime in June, July, or August of 2020, just please note that these new rules may not actually be in effect yet. So you should reference the HOS rules that are currently in place and just do a little bit of double checking to make sure that you are going to be within compliance. So let's get to some of the highlights, because there's a few important ones that I want to call out. So the first one I want to call out is some additional flexibility in the language for how a driver uses the 10-hour rest period. So earlier we talked about that 8-2 split, which was that 8 hours of consecutive rest followed by the 2 hours of off duty. Well, now we've got language that basically suggests that there will be an opportunity for a 7-3 split. So the 7 hours of rest followed by 3 hours of off duty. And effectively what this does is give drivers just a little bit more flexibility in how they get to that 10-hour number, effectively giving them the chance to do 14 total hours of on duty, but doing it within a 17-hour window, which is more flexibility than they've had for quite a bit of time. So hopefully that gives drivers a little bit more opportunity in how they structure their day, and again, create some more flexibility relative to that 10-hour split, either the 8-2 or the 7-3. The second change, which I think drivers are really going to appreciate, is some adjustments to the language relative to that 30-minute break. So you'll remember earlier we talked about the rule changes that came into effect in 2011, basically requiring a driver to take a 30-minute break after 8 hours of on-duty time. Well, now that language is changing, and now it's 8 hours of consecutive drive time. So going back to that example that we gave of a driver who maybe starts their day at a shipper dock and has to spend 2, 3, 4 hours tied up in detention before they actually get to start driving. Well, now the terms of the current or the new HOS regulation will be a little bit more favorable for them, so that if they're spend 2, 3, 4 hours tied up at the beginning of their on-duty cycle, that's not going to eat into their drive time where they have to work towards that 30-minute break. So now it's 30-minute break after 8 consecutive hours of drive time, not 8 consecutive hours of on-duty time, and I think that's an important distinction. Another change in the rules is specific to the adverse conditions. So in the current HOS final rule, what the language basically states is that if a driver encounters adverse conditions, so unexpected traffic, an accident, severe weather, or something along those lines that they couldn't predict, if they encounter those adverse conditions in the 11th hour of their day, they will be granted an additional 2 hours of driving time, effectively taking that cap from 11 to 13 total hours. But importantly, it notes that if you encounter those adverse conditions in the 11th hour or at the 11th hour, the new language changes that to basically state that if you encounter those adverse conditions at any point in that 11-hour period, you will be granted that 2-hour extension. So really what that does is kind of create some gray area or some murky waters and give an opportunity for drivers to kind of have an additional 2 hours carte blanche if they wish, because it's going to get really difficult for state-level DOT officers to actually dispute or verify the validity of whether or not that driver encountered a adverse condition at some point in the past. So you can imagine the circumstances of a driver, potentially being pulled over, getting the hours checked, being at a 12-hour day and basically stating that they had adverse conditions maybe 1 or 2 states ago due to an accident or traffic or something along those lines. It's going to be really difficult for that state level officer to actually confirm whether or not that happened if they're citing it that they encountered adverse conditions several hundred miles ago. So I think that this is probably going to need to be tightened up a little bit. This is interesting. Otherwise, we're kind of just creating opportunities for drivers to all have an additional 2 hours if they would wish. And I think that that's going to need some clarification, but that's a really interesting change in the new HOS rules. So then there are basically some additional changes relative to exemptions for local drivers. So the current HOS rules as they stand right now basically state that if you are within 100 air miles that you operate from your home base, then you get exemption from these things. They're now expanding that to 150 miles and then basically expanding the on-duty time for those operators from 12 hours to 14 hours. So it's a change of 12 hours to 14 hours and then 100 air miles to 150 air miles. So what is all this going to mean? Well, it's a little bit early to tell right now. Certainly there's likely to be some additional pushback from certain players within the trucking industry that don't like these new regulations. I think you can expect to see some additional disputes or potentially some litigation relative to that. But certainly some industry experts are already predicting that this is going to create more flexibility, which is going to increase capacity, which is certainly something that shippers will be excited to hear. More trucks, more capacity certainly means that they're going to get more leverage in their pricing negotiations, and potentially that will suggest more favorable terms for shippers moving forward if these regulations do in fact create more capacity, as some experts believe that they will. In addition, the FMCSA is touting that the new regulation will lead to considerable savings for the U.S. economy and for U.S. consumers to the tune of several $100 million. Again, we will see if those claims actually turn out to be true, but certainly that could be a good thing for the U.S. economy if they are accurate. So that is it. I appreciate you watching. I hope that you found this video valuable and that if you are new to transportation and logistics, you learned some new things about the hours of service rules, the FMCSA and their responsibilities. And for you more veteran transportation professionals out there, hopefully this was a concise summary of the new HOS rules that should be going into effect sometime in September of 2020 and what they mean for you. So if you found value in this video, I would appreciate if you would like it, if you would subscribe. This is a brand new channel, so any support means a lot. If you have questions, feel free to comment down below. I will do my best to get to everyone, but I do appreciate you swinging by. I do appreciate you checking out this video, and I hope everybody stays safe and has a fantastic day. So thanks again, everyone.